Hello everybody and welcome to DC Fine Art. Today we're going to be working on a lipstick with the Faber Castell Pitt Artist pins right here. Now this video is going to show you how I created the lipstick part, the gold part of the lipstick, and then also the base red and the cap that's red. And all this will be done with the Pitt Artist pins by Faber Castell. Now, it's really hard for me to tell you exactly which color I pick up at all times. It's just really hard because I keep on mixing colors as I go, whether or not I make them darker or make those shades a little darker or make them a little lighter. I do kind of go back and forth just a little bit on it. But if you're really wanting to know exactly what colors I used in order to create this lipstick, I will have that listed below in the description. So I'll make it easy for you because every time I used a color, I made sure to set it aside so that way I knew exactly what colors I used for each part. So I did that just for you guys, so that way if you're wanting to do something like this or maybe get a better idea of how I created this with the colors I used, that is listed below. I did not put the actual name of the colors on there. I just put the color number. So it should be able to give you a color name on the pen and then say like 121. That's a color number. So I went ahead and listed them off using those color numbers because my eyes are horrible and using that magnifying was really hard to try and see. So hopefully this better helps you guys on kind of seeing how what kind of colors I used in order to create the lipstick, the gold, or the red cap and base. Now, I didn't finish this painting completely, so the cherries are not done, and I do apologize for that. I will have to make a separate video just off the cherries and the gold leaf that I'm doing, so that will be on the next video, and it's because we got a powerful pack that has arrived, so I want to do my first review, and so I'm going to squeeze that in maybe Saturday or Sunday depending on how busy it is because I am creating Halloween decorations. So it has been very busy for me. So anyways, let's go ahead, turn this around, and let's get started on this lipstick. All right, so here we're going to start out with the lipstick itself. I have Indian red, and I am actually going around my highlights. I do not want to fill that in right now. Make sure that if there's any kind of bright white highlights or any kind of lighter highlights, try and leave those separated, especially if you're using your base color first, like I am here. Now this Indian red is the color that I'm wanting this lipstick to kind of be. It came out a little bit light with my first layer, but I can always go over it again with a second layer to make it a little bit darker. Now I'm taking my white and I'm going over where those white highlights are going to be. Now I don't want them too bright, so I'm going to put in a little bitty dots in with my Indian red, so that way I can give it a little bit of a tone of an Indian red and a lighter highlight. Or not as light as a highlight. So I'm going over it with my white over those little dots while those dots are still a little wet. They're not completely dry. That's why they blend out so nicely and you don't see a lot of the dots. To make this a little bit darker, I am using a raw umber to go over that area where I want it a little bit darker. Then I'm using my white, going back over some of these highlighted areas, and then going over it with some red. So the red that I'm using, like I said, I will have this listed in the description below by the number. And it's like just a red, going back over it with my Indian red again, because that's what color I'm wanting, just a little bit more darker. Going over red and putting red in there. Going back over with my Indian red, so I'm just layering in, adding a little bit more dots, so that way I can come on top of it with the white, and that makes it a little bit more of kind of like a lighter color of that. It's not too bright. If there is an area that needs to be a little bit brighter, you can always wait for it to dry and then go back over it again with your white, and it comes out a little bit more brighter. Here's a little bit of my warm gray that I kind of did some little touches to see if it showed up or I can make that kind of color, but it did not, so it's not listed. Now let's work on the gold. All right, we are starting on the gold part. I'm right now taking out one of my darker browns that I have. So I have 175, which is dark sepia, as my darkest brown, and then I also have my walnut brown, which is still a darker brown. So I'm using those for the dark lines in the lipstick reflection, and a little bit of my Indian reds tossed in there along with some of my ivory. And then I hop on over, that's still my ivory, and then I'll go ahead and grab a hold of my warm gray and toss that in there. Now, as you can see, I'm working lines. And the reason is because that's what the reference photo shows when you really zoom in and look at it. It's basically a bunch of lines and reflections. Here I'm using my green gold, that's what that yellow is, and I don't want it too bright, so I will be going over that with like either my warm gray or even an ivory or even a white, so that way I can tone that really bright green gold down and it makes it look a whole lot better. So there's that white, and I'm going on top of that green gold right here, and that just makes it just a little bit lighter of a gold. It's not too bright, that yellow kind of color. Now, I am following a reference photo by looking at it. I did link that in the description below if you guys are wanting to look over and try it yourself too. Or you can look at that reference photo. It is from Pixabay. It's free to use. So it's a really definitely fun to look at that and just see the lines of different colors. And that's all I'm doing. I'm making these little lines. I'm adding in some browns, some of my warm grays. Some of these I'm even layering just a little bit just to kind of give it that same, or at least close to the color that I see in the reference photo. Using some more of my ivory in there, and then a little bit of white just to kind of mute and mix those colors together. So white is very useful because it helps to lighten colors, or you can even use it to kind of blend in some of your colors too. But I like to use ivory for blending also. Here I'm taking that green gold on the outside here. Like I said, it is too bright of a gold color, so I will be going on top of that with my white. Going in some of these areas here, and I'm taking more of that darker brown. It's like a dark sepia, and just making those little lines where I see some of the darkest areas. That needs to be a little bit brighter, and that needs to be toned down. So I'm using white on top of that green gold in order to tone it down a little bit, because it was too white, or not too white, it was too yellow. So I needed to use the white in order to tone it down. Just following the reference photo, added some white for a little bit of highlight towards the top, and using that dark sepia to make the darkest shadow around the lipstick and the gold. So now I'm making my way on down using my warm gray, making the lines in it just the way I try and see in the reference photo. Now it may be a little bit different. I mean, I could make lines not exactly like the reference photo, but I try and get it as close as I can to the reference photo. So I do have like, it's almost like trying to follow a guide when you look at a reference photo. So I added in some grays in there, and then added in some of the browns. More of the green gold that I will end up going over with white. Some ivories going in with my gray again. That gray is a cold gray. Adding white in on top of it also. And then just adding in lines of either a darker brown or adding in some more of that green gold in there. So we're just making adjustments as we go. That was a really bright highlight, so I put white first, put warm gray on the other side of that line. You can see how the reflection kind of goes from one to the other, from the top to the bottom. There's some more of that green, or actually that's more of my brown. What is that? It's a raw umber. Then the green gold. So I'm just layering upon layering is all I'm doing. And then I will add a highlight towards the end on the very top. So when I get done with this, it'll have a little bit more white added to it for a highlight. Or I can add some darks for any kind of shadows. But here I am just following what I see in the reference photo, going up and down with these lines and using mostly my browns. There's some warm grays, some white in there. Coming in with some of the brown and then using ivory on top of it to tone it. Using my green gold. Some more of my dark brown and some grays. Adding a little bit of white to kind of tone and mix those colors there. Adding a little bit of a highlight to the top of that by adding in some white. Sometimes if it doesn't look like it added enough white, just wait, let it dry, and then go over it again. There's more of my green gold in there. Adding some white to it so that way it's not too yellow. Adding another white strip across so that way we got a highlight. There it is. So that is the gold. Now we move on to the red base and cap. All right, so we are starting out with the red base and I am using a black. So I'm going to my darkest part first, but I am starting with that dark black line, tapering it off at a point, and then going in and adding some dots in there and then tapering it to a point. The reason why I'm adding the dots, and I do it along here too, but I'm going to make this one a little bit more solid at the base of that dark, and then I'm going to start adding in some little dots kind of coming out from it. The reason why I do that is it kind of gradiates from dark and then transitions into more of that red, even though it's still dark. Now, if you work on the red and start adding it in with that black that is not completely dry around the edges, it will combine and kind of make it a darker red. The black will still be really standing out, but those dots kind of disintegrate. They kind of blend in with the red, so it makes it transition a little bit smoother around the edges if you catch it whenever it's still wet. So here I am just going from my mid-tone reds to my dark reds to my light red. I am going to leave the open area where it's that really bright highlight. I am going to use the brightest red there and then go over it with my white. And whenever we get to it, I'll show you how I do that. But I am just looking at the colors that I see in the reference photo, and I'm trying to follow the best that I possibly can. Now I only have 3 reds, and that is basically, I call it like my bright red, my mid-tone red, and my dark red. I know one's a deep red, the other one is a pale geranium lake, and the other one is a, let's see here, a deep scarlet red. So I just use those reds to go from bright to dark, and if I need to make them darker, then I will end up mixing in a cold gray in the mix just because I want to make it a little bit darker. So as long as you catch them when they're wet, you really can kind of mix those colors together. But you want to be very, very careful depending on what kind of paper you're using, so that way you don't, because when you put it on your first layer and it's not completely dry, you can end up having your paper roll up on you. So just be very cautious when working wet on wet with your markers. Sometimes you may have to go with a super, super light hand and not try and go back and forth on it. Just kind of hit it and then go over it a little bit, but very lightly. If you start to see it kind of crumble up a little bit or the paper start to ruffle at any point, you're just going to have to let that completely dry before trying to add anything to it, and just go really lightly. Now, as you can see, I'm putting this bright red in first, and I'm going around the brightest area, like leaving a gap to where I can put my white in there and make it my brightest highlight. So I'm waiting. Now I'm coming in with my white, going on top of it. If it stands out just a little bit too bright, I can come back in and add a little bit of red dots in there, or bright red dots. Here I'm adding some gray around the black here, so that way I got a little bit better transition, a little bit of gray on the base part of it for a shadow. So I'm using that gray and then putting red in there on top of it too, so that way it's got a darker red, and that's how I get that transition. If you can't go any darker and you're only working with 3 reds and you need to go darker, start mixing it with some other colors, and I mix mine with a gray. Going on top of it again with some red. And there is the base for the lipstick, and now we're going to be moving on to this cap. So I changed those reference photos out for you. Like I said, it's in the description below, but you can also see it here. I got it zoomed in a little bit. But I'm putting in my red first, my brighter reds, and then putting in white on top. I will have to go over it again with the white, just so that way the rim of the cap shines a little bit brighter, or it has a little bit of a reflection. Putting black in the center. And I will be using all the same colors I did over on the base, except that I'm going to be using it on the cap. So here I am just taking a ruler to make sure I get a straight line in there. And I'm using that black for the darkest part of the shadow underneath the lid. And then I'm making little dots as I come up with the black. So that way we can transition it from dark to light. Going from that darker shadow into the reds. I will end up coming back through, adding a little bit of that gray, going from the black to the gray. That way when I go on top of it with my red, it is a darker red. Darker than the red that I have, so it kind of gives it a little bit of a shadow of a red. Now I'm going over my brightest highlight with my white. As you can see, it looks like it's light pink that I just went over it. That's actually because I still had some red that was on my white pen here. So, or brush pen. So that was fine. I seen it on there. You can always use another piece of paper and just kind of scribble on it until all that red comes off and it's pure white again. But for this instance, I didn't really mind that it had a little bit of red on the tip of my white because I knew it was going to come out as a light pink. That was perfectly fine since I don't have a super bright highlight. And also it kind of tells me where that highlight's going to be too. Otherwise, white would blend in way too easily. So here I'm going on top of that gray with a red, my darker red. And then I'm coming in here with my brighter reds around where these highlights are on the top. Putting it in a bright red right in there, bright red in there, but then I'm putting that white back in just so I know that that's where my reflections are. Then I'm transitioning to a darker red on the top, just like what you see in the reference photo. That's all you got to do. And also remember that even if you have lines, you know, that you can see with your marker, that's perfectly fine because you can always go over it again with a second coat, and that should be able to get rid of some of those lines in there. Plus that, when you step back and you look at it from a distance like you would if it was hanging on your wall, you really don't see too much of that unless you get right up, your nose right up to it, but that's not normally how people look at paintings. Usually they look at it when they're standing on the ground looking at it. So even if you see a couple little lines in there, that's usually pretty fine if you could see them. That's the reason why if I use markers, I tend to try and go in the same direction as the rest of the lines. So that way they all are going the same direction if any of the lines do end up showing. If you kind of go out of the line, just remember, use your white pen, and that should get rid of that if you go out of lines into your white like I did. I did it twice, and then I just used my white, and that took care of it. It just went ahead and blocked it out. And I'm just kind of going over this a little bit more with some of my darker reds, just making sure that it does look like red, not like gray, and has a nice shadow to it. Adding a little bit more of my brighter reds in there and adjusting some of these highlights out. making it a little bit lighter in these areas. And we're getting pretty close to summing it up, making it a little bit darker in here with a darker red. Using a little bit more gray because I want that to be a little bit more darker on the bottom, and then putting red on top of that gray. Adding a little white to that where I got out of line, and adding some more red in that shadowy area. Adding a little bit of gray to darken that up, darker than the red that I had, and then adding red on top. Well, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. And if you could, please leave a like, subscribe, share, or leave a comment. Any of those things definitely helps this channel grow. And also, if you're wanting slower tutorials, I do have that over on my Patreon. The link is in the description below. And there I have oil pastel videos, I have color pencil, I have charcoal, and I have acrylic painting. And right now we are working on a soft pastel chimpanzee, and I do break them down into segments so that way they're not too long, and we work specifically on those segments as we go. So I guess until next time, bye you guys.